Mark and Aaron have been members of the congregation for 2 years. Has it been 2 years now? Maybe? But we're so glad to have him here, and he's a professor of mass communications at Emory and Henry College.
Morning, y'all. So I did not bring matzo ball soup this time. Sorry. So I read in the newspaper yesterday that the Bristol Police Department is putting "In God We Trust" on the bumpers of their cars. And I was sitting at the table and I relayed this news to Erin with sort of a heavy sigh. And she said something like, there's so many more important things facing us right now. And she's totally right. In this era, there are many more important issues facing us. But I had actually originally planned on doing this talk today about what it felt like to be Jewish in Southwest Virginia. I'm sorry, what it feels to me to be Jewish in Southwest Virginia. And so I wanted to mention this story as sort of a preamble. Because as you might suspect, sometimes it's not all that easy. I found myself to be the butt of jokes told offhand without the slightest thought, and my cultural and symbolic traditions are often overlooked and undervalued in our institutions as well as informally. I experience slights of this type pretty frequently, and while it is pretty insignificant, putting "In God We Trust" on police vehicles feels like a microaggression to me. It's an institutional statement that reminds me of my difference. I've stood up for differences on occasion. I stand up for differences a lot. I stood up for my own differences on occasion. I've had a loud argument with a local official who insisted that we have conservative Christian prayers and no other types of prayers at our town council meetings, and I lost that argument. But I also let a lot of stuff go by. I choose to carry a lot of it on myself, and I carry that weight. And so, this feeling is not what I'm going to talk about today. I just sort of wanted to preamble it a little bit because I feel like that underlies what I'm talking about today. Instead, there's a socio-cultural term that I learned recently that I want to explore with y'all because I think it's interesting, but also because it's provided me with a sense of solace and a way forward, I feel like, when things get tough. And this term, dense particularity. It was coined by a literary critic named Satya Mahantni in 1989 in an article called "Us and Them on the Philosophical Basis of Political Criticism." In the article, he writes, quote, "How do we negotiate between my history and yours? It is necessary to assert our dense particularities, our lived and imagined differences. But can we afford to leave untheorized the question of how our differences are intertwined and indeed hierarchically organized? Could we, in other words, afford to have entirely different histories, to see ourselves living and having lived in entirely heterogeneous and discrete spaces?" End quote. I know this quote is complicated. I think it's a trait of literary critics. But I see that there's an important message in here for myself in this article. Mahantni is writing about cultural anthropology and argues that an anthropologist's obsession with relativism is a mistake. Relativism is this idea that knowledge, truth, and morality exists in relation to one's culture, society, their historical context, right? They argue that these things are not absolute, that there's no absolute morality, that everything has to be considered from within a different context. So a relativist scholar would argue that we can't judge someone else's traditions and beliefs because we don't have the benefit of their cultural experiences to draw on, right? But Mahantni is opposed to this. Instead, he thinks that, instead of thinking that seemingly irrational behaviors observed in different cultures should be just accepted as different, he suggests that doing so is an artifact of cultural exceptionalism, leading to misunderstanding and ultimately to feelings of superiority. Instead, he argues that there are irrational behaviors and ideas in all cultures, which are principally based in people's historical situatedness, right? The way that we grew up teaches us to treat things differently, but that we all do this. And these are the results of shared and contested meanings, values, and material resources fought over and resolved over time. Mahatma argues that an anthropologist must instead think about other people and evaluate cultural practices through a culturally sympathetic lens to pay attention for the plurality of our heterogeneous lives. That's some pretty highfalutin scholarly work, and as confusing as it seems, I benefited from hearing someone speak about dense particularity before I read the article, and I think there are some practical applications for 2017 United States. I first learned of the term dense particularity when I attended the National Communication Association's annual convention, which was the weekend after the presidential election last fall. Having researched and planned serious, complex, and conceptual works and talks for the convention, I was delighted to learn when I got there that most of us had significantly revised our presentations in the 48 hours between the election results and arriving in Philadelphia. In the headlining talk of the Political Communication Division, for instance, instead of the single paper winner reading their article on political communication strategy and blah, 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 a panel of leading scholars sat there and sort of reflectively considered the rhetorical techniques, the emotional aspects, what it felt like to be a professor of mass communications or just communications in an era where we had, first of all, totally missed the main story of the election, and also where we all felt like something was not right. It felt wonderful to sit in this room with these other experts who, just like me, had completely misread the tea leaves. The term dense particularity was used by one of the three speakers at the keynote address on the opening session, which was called Putting Bodies on the Line and Words into Action, celebrating the joys of, challenges in, and opportunities for civic engagement. His talk about the intersection of scholar and citizen asked us to consider our professional selves differently in two ways. In the first, he asked us what limiting power we impose on ourselves when we think of ourselves as scholars. And in the second, using Mahatma, he asked us to think about our context as heterogeneous. So regarding thing number one there, I've always struggled with this scholar-citizen question. As a mass communications professor, I'm frequently engaged with people outside of the academy about what the media are and what the media do. And in many such cases, it comes down to the extent to which we should trust the media. Ironically, given my professional role as a critical scholar, I find myself these days defending media much more frequently than I would have thought. I mean, as the guy who researched and wrote a book about how mainstream television news failed to adequately inform U.S. citizens about the conflict between Iraq and the United States in 2003, I never thought that I would also be defending mainstream news as basically truthful and worthwhile. But over time, and especially here in 2017, I find myself defending the mainstream media, arguing that the same sources that smugly predicted that Clinton would win with an 80% certainty are trustworthy. But my real point has to do with his second challenge. I'm a mass communications professor. I spend a lot of my time thinking, reading, writing, and talking about mass communications. But I'm not just that. Right? I'm also Jewish. I'm a father, a husband, a son, a brother, a Roanoker, cisgender, a fly fisherman, poorly, a hiker, a bass player, also poorly, a handyman, a jogger, a TV and movie lover, a reader, a relaxer, a UU, a human. I'm a globalist, as Trump might call me. I feel the need to consider other people when I or we do things. I make mistakes regularly, and sometimes they have important consequences for me and the people that I care about and who care about me. But that keynote speaker used this phrase, dense particularity, in asking us to think of our context heterogeneously, to think about how in every moment, every thought, behavior, choice, or emotion that we feel is an articulation of everything else in our lives since before we can remember anything. I'm going to read that part one more time. The keynote speaker used the phrase, dense particularity, and asking us to think of our contexts heterogeneously, to think about how in every moment, every thought, behavior, choice, or emotion we feel is an articulation of everything else in our lives since before we can remember anything. Sitting in the audience, I had a sort of an epiphany as I realized that the things informing me were so much more complex, broad, and deep than I could conceive of, that I was being constituted in that moment on the basis of things that had happened to me and things that I had observed that I couldn't even remember. I tried to teach this term, dense particularity, to my intro students a few weeks ago, my intro mass communications course. We were considering the ways that popular culture had led the way in bridging cultural boundaries. Looking at how, like, rockabilly, for instance, as a musical genre, helped people in urban settings learn a way to appreciate rural America, and vice versa, or how Madonna led a generation of people to question the boundaries of femininity and sexuality. I'll admit that I've struggled with this course this term. For some reason, the students seem a little more resistant to the concepts that I kind of take for granted. And I was having a hard time convincing them of the importance of that music has played in helping us understand different cultures and different people. But then on a whim, I showed them Beyonce's 2016 music video for the song Formation. Have any of y'all seen this video? You should go see it. Like, you should all go home today and hop on YouTube and watch the music video for Formation. I really recommend that you do. Formation is a song and a video that is, according to Asamiki Natasha Tinsley, a professor of African and African diaspora studies at UT Austin, quote, what it would look like if black women's lives mattered. In the song and the video, which were purposely released on the same day, and one day prior to her performing it at the Super Bowl halftime show last year, Beyoncé represents a celebration of her formation, her dense particularity, her heritage, her body, her politics, her talent, her family, etc. Tinsley calls it a tapestry of a tapestry of black women's colorful, textured lives. But at the same time that Beyoncé is using the term formation to mean those things that have formed her, she also asks others to join her in formation, right? She sings, okay, ladies, now to get in formation. Prove to me you got some coordination or you get eliminated. As powerful and provocative as the lyrics are, the music video is powerful as well. It is full of scenes such as Old South plantations, flooded New Orleans, and black bodies up against riot police that reimagine our cultural memories and confront a disparity between the experiences of white and black Americans. Well, finally my students got it. In this moment, they were able to see themselves as densely particular, composed today and every day of those moments and experiences that make them unique, and just as importantly, that guide them in their interactions with each other and with the world. And just like Beyoncé showed them what I meant by dense particularity, it was in that moment of observing them that I became much more self-reflective about my own dense particularity and began to see it as a way out of this malaise that I have been feeling since November. I acknowledge that I have little patience for those who are critical of political correctness. Or who complain about the special snowflakes in our political world. To me, those ideas exemplify the problems with relativism and that Mahatma wrote about. Because instead of attempting to evaluate cultural differences through a sympathetic lens that might teach them something about themselves, people who use these terms are engaging in a sort of unreflective, relativistic exceptionalism. The kind of dehumanization that allows people to characterize today's protesters as snowflakes, upset about the election, is only possible by convincing oneself that cultures are separated, that our lives are not intertwined. It is also a refusal to acknowledge the denseness of others' experiences. You know, what this gives us through these rhetorical attempts to separate and dehumanize are simplistic and naive caricatures of human life, relativistic and ethnocentric. And these prevent us from both understanding and from progress. But, and this is where I get a tiny bit optimistic, this dense particularity is also why I call myself a Unitarian Universalist, and how I come to find solace in this space. As a UU community, we've committed ourselves to the 7 principles and purposes that are printed on the program, right? And each week we look at these things. And as I thought more and more about dense particularity, I began to see these principles as implicit manifestations of it. When we commit to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, we acknowledge that we are composed differently, and that those differences do not elevate some and denigrate others. When we affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion, we do so on the basis of the same implied approach. Our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, reflects Mahatma's idea that we must evaluate cultures with sympathy. And our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, reminds us that we do not live in a vacuum, that our actions affect others and theirs affect us. Just last week, Linda's talk about crucifixion and resurrection exemplified the best of these qualities in our principles, because it reminds us that the followers of Jesus are not the only ones who can lay claim to the martyrdom of their loss. As Linda demonstrated, symbolic crucifixions or public and politically motivated acts of assassination have happened throughout human history with alarming frequency, as have the purposeful and peaceful coming back from death to life, or resurrection. The key and the benefit of our UU principles, to me, is to see these losses and advances as commensurate, to remember that tragic loss is a feature of every community, and that it motivates the behavior, faith, the ideas, and practices of their members every day. I appreciate the opportunity that coming here has given me to be more self-reflective about my own dense particularity. I'll admit that I sometimes struggle, as you might have observed throughout this talk, to give others the benefit of their own dense particularities in our interactions. I think the next step in this process for me is to more actively acknowledge that every day and every moment we all operate in the fullness of our identities. The things that are important to me are not all that important to everyone, and that every interaction I have with others is, in a sense, a competition of our collective dense particularities, a phenomenon that some have come to call thick intersectionality. So I'll just close by offering a few sort of rhetorical questions. What does it mean when the Bristol Police Department adds "In God We Trust" to their bumpers? Is that any different than Allahu Akbar, which means God is great? What historical and cultural experiences prompt a government agency to post religious symbols on their official vehicles? And as we look to the future, in what ways will these experiences today affect us tomorrow?